The moment Adelaide Bailey stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Nevada, in the summer of 1882, she knew she had made a terrible mistake wearing her late mother's pearl brooch, because the first man to notice it was the one she had traveled 400 miles to avoid. The town of Dusty Creek sat in the middle of the Nevada high desert like a stubborn mule that refused to move, a collection of sun-bleached buildings pressed together along a single wide road that turned to mud when it rained and cracked to dust when it did not. The general store faced the saloon. The barber faced the jail. The hotel, a two-story structure of questionable lumber, stood at the far end of Main Street like a man trying to look taller than he was. It was a rough town, as most Nevada towns were in those days, full of men who had come for silver and stayed for reasons they rarely admitted out loud. Adelaide stepped down from the stage and pressed her traveling case to her chest. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a dusty green hat, and eyes the color of creek water in late autumn, somewhere between brown and gold depending on the light. She was not a fragile woman. She had grown up on a Kansas homestead, learned to shoot a rifle before she learned to read cursive, and had buried her father the previous winter with her own hands because there was no one else to do it. But standing in Dusty Creek with the Nevada sun hammering down on her shoulders and the sound of a man shouting her name from across the street, she felt about as small as she ever had in her life. Adelaide Bailey. She did not turn around. She gripped her case tighter and walked toward the hotel. "I know you hear me, woman." The voice belonged to Gerald Holt. He was 51 years old, heavyset, with a walrus mustache and small eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. He was also, technically, her dead husband's business partner, and he had been pursuing her for the better part of 8 months with the single-minded determination of a man who believed a widow was simply an opportunity that had not yet been properly seized. When her husband, Thomas Bailey, had died of a fever in the spring of 1881, he had left behind a debt to Gerald Holt that Adelaide had spent 14 months trying to pay down. She had sold the horses. She had sold the furniture. She had taken in sewing and washing. She had sold everything that was not nailed to the floor, and then she had sold some of the floor. And still Holt had shown up at her door in Caldwell, Kansas, with papers in hand, claiming that the remaining debt entitled him to the deed on her property. Her lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Abner Cross, had told her the papers were questionable at best and fraudulent at worst. But he had also told her that fighting them in court would take money she did not have and time she could not afford. He had told her that if she could prove she had a husband, a living husband, someone who could stand beside her and dispute the papers on her behalf, the courts would be far more sympathetic. It was not fair. It was not right. But it was 1882, and that was the way things worked. So Adelaide Bailey had packed what little remained of her life into a single case and boarded a stagecoach heading west, because she had a distant cousin in Dusty Creek named Pearl who had written to her and said that Nevada courts moved slower, and that a woman could sometimes find a fighting chance in the spaces between the law and the land. Pearl had also written, in a postscript that Adelaide had read 6 times on the journey west, that there was a good honest man in town who sometimes helped people in difficult situations, a cowboy who had lived in the territory long enough to know the judges and the clerks and the way things could be arranged. Pearl had not mentioned that Gerald Holt would follow her all the way to Nevada. "Adelaide, I am speaking to you." She pushed through the door of the hotel without looking back. The lobby of the Dusty Creek Hotel smelled like tobacco and sawdust, and something that might have been stew. A boy of about 12 sat behind the front desk reading a dime novel. Looked up with wide eyes when Adelaide walked in. "I need a room," she said, "and I need to know if a woman named Pearl Garver is in this town." The boy blinked. "Miss Pearl, she lives on the east side, ma'am, past the livery, yellow house with the blue shutters." "Thank you." Adelaide set coins on the counter. "If a large man with a walrus mustache comes in asking for me, I was never here." The boy pocketed the coins with the speed of someone who had been bribed before. Never saw you in my life, ma'am." She took her room, locked the door, and stood with her back against it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she straightened her spine, unpinned her hat, and began to think. Pearl Garver was Adelaide's mother's cousin's daughter, which made them cousins in the way that many Western people called each other cousins, without being entirely certain of the mathematics. Pearl was 30 years old, wiry and sharp, with the kind of practical intelligence that came from having lived alone in a mining town for 6 years. When Adelaide found her way to the yellow house with the blue shutters 2 hours later, Pearl opened the door before she could knock. "I saw the stage come in," Pearl said, pulling her inside. "And I saw Gerald Holt get off the second stage about an hour behind you. I figured you'd come find me eventually." "He followed me," Adelaide said, sitting down hard in a wooden chair. "I was careful. I left in the middle of the night. I told no one where I was going. Men like Holt have ways of finding things out." Pearl poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove. "He wants that deed, Adelaide, and he wants you on the deed too, from what you wrote me." Adelaide accepted the coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup. "He made that very clear. He told me last spring that the most convenient resolution to the debt would be for me to marry him." Pearl's expression said everything that needed to be said about that. "I would sooner walk into the desert," Adelaide said. "I know it." Pearl sat down across from her. "That's why I mentioned Emmett Quinn." The name landed quietly in the room. Adelaide looked up. "The man you wrote about." "The very one." Pearl sipped her coffee. "Emmett Quinn has been in Dusty Creek for 4 years. He runs cattle on a spread about 6 miles east of town, does some work for the county sheriff on occasion, and generally keeps to himself. He is 30 years old, Adelaide. He is honest. He is not a bad-looking man, which might matter to the pretense if Holt is suspicious, and he has done something like this before." Adelaide set her cup down. "He has pretended to be someone's husband before. Once. For a woman who was trying to get her children across a border dispute down near the Arizona territory. He spent 2 weeks being her husband on paper and then helped her get settled in Tucson." Pearl shrugged. "He did not do it for money. He did it because she had nowhere else to turn." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window at a low angle, and outside she could hear the distant sound of the town going about its business, horses and voices, and the occasional clang of something metallic. "Would he do it again?" she asked. "I already sent word to him this morning when I saw the stage come in. He should be coming into town tomorrow." Adelaide exhaled. "And if he says no?" Pearl gave her a look that suggested she had already thought through all the contingencies. "Then we think of something else, but I do not believe he will say no." Emmett Quinn arrived the following morning on a roan horse that looked like it had seen every kind of weather and come to peace with all of them. Adelaide watched him from Pearl's front window, her coffee going cold in her hands. He was tall in the saddle in the way that men who had spent years on horseback always were, not stiff but settled, like the horse was simply an extension of him. He wore a plain brown hat with a straight brim, a denim shirt the color of a winter sky, and worn leather boots. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something slightly harder than wood, and when he swung down from the horse and tied the reins to Pearl's fence post, he moved with the kind of unhurried ease that Adelaide associated with people who had decided, at some point, that panic was a waste of time. Pearl opened the door before he could knock, too. Adelaide noticed he seemed unsurprised by this. "Pearl," he said, taking his hat off. His hair was dark and slightly longer than was strictly fashionable, curling a little at the back of his neck. "You said there was a situation. Come in. There's someone I want you to meet." He stepped inside and his eyes found Adelaide immediately, the way eyes do when they are looking for something specific. He held her gaze for a moment without speaking, which she found either very respectful or slightly unnerving and could not quite decide which. "Miss Bailey," Pearl said, "this is Emmett Quinn. Emmett, this is Adelaide Bailey. She has come from Kansas and she needs help." Emmett Quinn turned his hat in his hands once, a slow rotation that seemed like it was something he did when he was thinking. "Miss Bailey," he said. His voice was low and even, not the theatrical drawl of someone performing being a cowboy, but a plain, honest voice that belonged to a man who spoke less than he listened. "Mr. Quinn," Adelaide said. She stood up from her chair, because she found that things went better if you were standing when you had a difficult thing to say. "I will not waste your time with a slow approach to this. I need someone to pretend to be my husband for 1 week. I have papers I need to file with the county court, and those papers will be received better if I am a married woman. There is a man who followed me here from Kansas who is trying to take my property through fraudulent debt claims, and I cannot fight him alone. I can pay you $30, which is nearly everything I have left." The room was very quiet. Emmett looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Pearl, who gave him the particular expression of a woman who would appreciate his cooperation. $30 is a lot of money," he said. "It is," Adelaide agreed. "I know it." "You can keep it," he said. Adelaide blinked. "I beg your pardon. Keep your money." He put his hat back on and then seemed to think better of it and took it off again. "Tell me about the man who followed you. Tell me about the papers. Tell me what week this needs to be, and I will tell you if I can help." Adelaide told him. She told him all of it, from Thomas's death to the debt to Gerald Holt's increasingly aggressive visits to her lawyer's advice. Emmett listened with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, and he did not interrupt her once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The county court here holds session on Fridays," he said. "It's Tuesday. That gives us 3 days to get the papers filed and have something on record. If Holt is presenting fraudulent documents, a judge in this county is going to want to see something that disputes them, and a husband's testimony is going to carry more weight than a widow's alone." He said this last part without any particular judgment, simply as a fact about the world as it was. "After Friday, you'll want to stay another few days until the ruling comes down. Call it a week altogether." "That is exactly what I thought," Adelaide said. "All right," he said. "I will do it." She had not expected him to agree that quickly. She had prepared arguments and she did not need any of them. It threw her slightly. "Just like that," she said. Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible, almost like the beginning of a smile that stopped itself. "A man trying to steal a widow's land through false papers is not something I have much patience for. Just like that." Pearl looked extremely pleased with herself. The arrangement was practical. Emmett had a friend in town named Caleb Marsh who owned a small house and would let them use the second bedroom without asking too many questions. They would present themselves around town as husband and wife, Adelaide having arrived to join him after settling her late husband's affairs in Kansas. It was close enough to the truth to be comfortable in the telling. Adelaide would wear Thomas's wedding ring on her right hand, since she had already moved it there after his death, and slide it back to her left. Emmett would introduce her at the saloon, at the general store, at the sheriff's office, everywhere that counted. The first test came faster than either of them expected. Gerald Holt was in the general store the following morning when Emmett and Adelaide walked in together to buy flour and coffee. Adelaide felt the man's presence before she saw him, a kind of pressure in the air that she had learned to associate with his company. She went rigid for half a second, and then Emmett's hand was at the small of her back, not grabbing, just steady, a warm presence that said, without any words, "I am here and we are doing this." She exhaled and kept walking. "Adelaide." Holt's voice was honey poured over gravel. He was standing by the counter, wearing a town suit that had traveled poorly, and his small eyes moved from her to Emmett with quick calculation. "I was wondering when I'd find you." "Gerald," she said, and she was proud of how steady her voice was. "And who might this be?" She felt Emmett shift slightly beside her, and she moved first. "This is my husband," she said. "Emmett Quinn. Emmett, this is Gerald Holt." He was Thomas's business partner. Emmett put out his hand and Holt shook it, the way men do when they are each trying to determine what the other is made of through the pressure of a grip. "Didn't know Adelaide had remarried," Holt said, studying Emmett with unconcealed suspicion. "Last autumn," Emmett said, which they had agreed upon beforehand. "We kept it quiet. Adelaide was still in mourning." Funny she never mentioned it in our correspondence. I don't imagine she mentions everything to you, Emmett said, pleasantly enough, and Adelaide could have kissed him for the tone of it, which was perfectly civil and left Holt nowhere comfortable to put his suspicion. Holt looked between them for a long moment. I have legal papers, he said, concerning a debt that Adelaide's late husband owed me. So I've heard, Emmett said. You'll want to take those to the county court. We'll be there Friday. Holt's mustache twitched. Is that so? That's so, Emmett agreed. They bought their flour and coffee and walked back out into the sunshine, and they did not speak until they had turned the corner off Main Street. Then Adelaide stopped walking and pressed her free hand flat against her sternum because her heart was going at a remarkable pace. You were very good in there, she said. You weren't bad yourself. He was looking straight ahead and she thought she could see the corner of his mouth. You didn't flinch when he came at you. I flinched on the inside. Well, keep that on the inside and you'll be fine. They walked back to Caleb Marsh's house, and Adelaide thought about the warmth of his hand at her back for longer than was probably necessary. The second day brought complications. Pearl came to the house at breakfast time with news that Holt had been asking around town about Emmett Quinn, specifically about how long he had lived in Dusty Creek, and whether anyone had seen him with a wife before. Pearl reported this with a brisk efficiency that suggested she found Holt's investigative efforts predictable and slightly irritating. He's going to find someone who will tell him they never heard of you being married, Pearl said, accepting the coffee Adelaide offered her. Let him, Emmett said from across the table. He was eating eggs, unhurried, the way he seemed to do most things. Everything we're saying is consistent. We kept it quiet. I didn't bring her out here until she'd settled Thomas's affairs. Anyone in this town who knows me well enough to speak to my character knows I'm not a man who would parade his personal life around a saloon. That's true, Pearl allowed. You're famously private. I prefer the word contained, Emmett said, which made Adelaide laugh, unexpected and genuine, and when she laughed Emmett looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, something curious and warm and quickly set aside. Pearl noticed. Pearl noticed everything, but she was tactful enough not to say anything about it. That afternoon, Emmett took Adelaide out to see his cattle operation, partly because it would look right for a wife to see what her husband owned, and partly because he seemed to genuinely want to show it to her. It was 6 miles east of town on good high desert land that turned green at the edges where a creek ran through it. He had 40 head of cattle, a small but solid herd, and a low ranch house that was plain but well built, with a porch facing west toward the hills. Adelaide stood on that porch and looked at the hills going orange in the afternoon light and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. You built this? She asked. Most of it, he said, standing beside her. The first walls were already here when I bought the land, some old prospectors claim. I took what was usable and built the rest. How long did it take? About 2 years for it to feel like mine. She turned to look at him. He was watching the hills with a quiet attention, and she thought that this was what he looked like when he was not performing anything, when he was simply himself in his own place. It was a good thing to see. Why did you agree to help me? She asked. And do not say it was because of Holt's fraudulent papers. That was part of it, but it was not all of it. He was quiet for a moment. She had learned already that his silences were not evasive. They were honest. He was simply finding the right words. When I was 12 years old, he said, my mother was widowed. My father died of a kick from a horse. Stupid accident, the kind that shouldn't have ended a man. And the day after we buried him, 2 of his creditors came to the door and told my mother she owed them money she had never borrowed. They had papers. She couldn't read much. She signed things she shouldn't have signed. He stopped. We lost everything. The farm, the equipment, everything. My mother took me and my sister to my grandmother's house in Ohio and never came back west. Adelaide was very still. I came west anyway, he said. Because I wanted to be the kind of man who could build something the creditors couldn't take. And somewhere along the way, I decided I'd help other people do the same, if I could. Adelaide looked back at the hills. The light was going golden and the cattle moved slowly in the distance like a slow brown river. "I am sorry about your mother," she said. "She's all right now," he said. "Remarried a schoolteacher in Ohio, happy enough." "Good," Adelaide said, and she meant it fully. They stayed on the porch a little longer than they needed to. It was the kind of evening that made staying easy, the air cooling slowly, the sky going through its colors without hurry. When they finally rode back to town, Adelaide noticed that she sat a little closer to him on the wagon bench than was strictly necessary, and that he did not increase the distance between them. Wednesday brought the lawyer. Emmett knew the county attorney, a compact man named Samuel Briggs who wore his suits like they were armor and argued like he meant every word. Emmett brought Adelaide to his office on Wednesday morning, and they sat across from him and laid out the full situation. Briggs listened with the focused expression of a man who was already organizing the counterargument before they finished speaking. "The papers Holt is presenting are dated 1880, Briggs said, tapping the copies Adelaide had brought. "But the debt your husband actually contracted was in 1879, and the terms were different. If you have any of your husband's correspondence, any letters, any receipts, anything that shows the original terms of the debt, that is going to be significant." Adelaide opened her traveling case and produced a small leather packet of papers she had been carrying against her ribs for 4 months. Briggs took them and spread them on his desk with the careful deliberation of a man handling something valuable. "These are good," he said, after a long examination. "These are very good. The original debt was $240. Holt is claiming $390. The difference is fabricated." He looked up. "Where did you keep these?" "Inside my corset mostly," Adelaide said. Emmett made a sound that was not quite a cough. Briggs looked slightly pink but pressed on. "We will file these with the court Friday morning before Holt has a chance to present. First on the docket is always the advantage." He looked at Emmett. "And your husband will be there to testify to the circumstances of the debt as he understands them." "He will," Emmett said. Adelaide looked at him. He was looking at Briggs, his expression steady and certain, and she felt a warmth she could not entirely account for settle somewhere in the center of her chest. They left Briggs's office and walked down Main Street, and Holt materialized from the direction of the saloon with 2 men Adelaide did not recognize flanking him like a pair of quotation marks around a sentence she didn't want to read. "Quinn," Holt said, stopping them. "Heard you have quite the spread out east." "It's a working ranch," Emmett said. "Funny thing," Holt said, and his tone was the conversational kind that meant something pointed was coming. "I spoke to a man named Reardon at the saloon last night. Says he's known you 4 years. Says he's never once heard you mention a wife." "Reardon talks more than he listens," Emmett said. "That's a distinction worth making." Holt's eyes moved to Adelaide with the appraising quality she had always hated about them. "You seem very settled here," he said to her, "for a woman who was in Kansas 6 days ago." "A woman goes where her husband is," Adelaide said, and hated that she had to say it but said it anyway because it was the language Holt understood. "Indeed." He smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "I'll see you Friday then." He walked on with his 2 silent men, and Adelaide watched him go and felt Emmett standing close behind her, not touching but present, a solid warmth at her back. "He brought friends," she said. "Hired ones by the look of them," Emmett said. "He always traveled alone from Kansas." "He has been busy." "So have we," he said, and she turned to look at him and found him watching her with an expression that was hard to read and did not seem to be trying very hard to hide that it was hard to read, which was different from his usual composure. "You handled that well." "I am getting used to the pretending," she said, and then something in her chest went slightly complicated because she was not entirely sure, standing there in the Nevada sunshine with Emmett Quinn at her back and his dark eyes on her face, that she was pretending anything at all. She looked away first. They walked back to the house and did not discuss what had just happened. That evening, Caleb Marsh had them both for supper along with Pearl, and it was the first meal Adelaide had eaten in several days that felt something like ordinary. Caleb was 45, weathered and genial, a man who had come to Nevada for silver and stayed because he liked the quiet. He knew the arrangement was a pretense. He was one of the few who did, and he treated it with a complete and comfortable discretion. "You're good together," he said to Pearl at one point, with Emmett and Adelaide both still at the table. Pearl looked at him and then at them and said nothing, which was itself a kind of statement. Emmett refilled Adelaide's coffee cup without being asked, and she said thank you, and their eyes met for a moment over the cup, and Caleb Marsh went back to his stew with a very slight smile that nobody mentioned. Later, Adelaide could not sleep. She lay in the second bedroom of Caleb's house and listened to the Nevada night, which was not quiet. Coyotes talked to each other in the distance. A horse stamped in the stable. The wind moved through the dry brush with a sound like paper. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Emmett Quinn, which was inconvenient and probably unwise and nevertheless entirely unavoidable. She thought about his voice when he had told her about his mother. She thought about the way he stood on his porch and looked at his hills like they were something he had earned and respected. She thought about his hand at her back in the general store, steady and warm and completely real. She rolled over and told herself to go to sleep. In the next room, she could hear nothing, because Emmett Quinn was apparently a very quiet sleeper. This, for some reason, made her smile into her pillow. Thursday was what Adelaide would later think of as the day things shifted. They rode out to the ranch in the morning because Emmett had work that needed doing regardless of county courts and fraudulent debtors, and Adelaide had offered to help because sitting in Caleb's house worrying seemed less useful. Emmett had looked at her when she offered, that measured look of his, and then nodded. He was working fence line on the eastern edge of the property, where 3 posts had gone soft at the base and needed replacing. Adelaide held the posts while he set them, working in the dry heat with his sleeves rolled to the elbow. It was hard, honest work, and they did it mostly in silence, and Adelaide found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind the silence at all. It was the comfortable kind, the kind that did not need to be filled. "You know how to do that," he said at one point, watching her tamp dirt around a post with a practiced hand. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "This is not so different." What happened to the farm? She had not planned to tell him the whole of it. But the question was genuine and his attention was genuine, and there was something about this wide-open Nevada landscape that made the truth feel less heavy than it did in enclosed spaces. "My father built it," she said. "I grew up on it. When I was 19, I married Thomas Bailey, who was a good man but not a lucky one. He had ambitions that outpaced his resources. He borrowed money for a cattle venture that didn't work out. The cattle died of something we never quite named. He borrowed more money to try again from Holt and others. The second venture wasn't much better. Then he got sick." She stopped, pushing dirt with the toe of her boot. "He died in March of 1881. He was 32 years old." Emmett was quiet. "He was not a bad man," she said. "He was just a man who wanted more than was easy to come by and who trusted people he should have looked at more carefully." "And you loved him," Emmett said. "It was not a question." "I did," she said. "I do." "In the way you love someone you built a life with, even if the life didn't turn out the way you planned." He nodded slowly. "And now you want your land back." "I want what he built to mean something," she said. "Even if it wasn't much, it was ours." He picked up the next post and she held it in place, and they worked for another hour without talking, and the silence between them felt like an agreement of some kind, though about what exactly, Adelaide was not prepared to examine. When they rode back toward town in the afternoon, they stopped at the creek where it ran through the edge of his land. Emmett's horse wanted water and he let it drink, and Adelaide's borrowed horse did the same, and they sat in the saddles and watched the water move over the stones. "Is this what you imagined Nevada would be?" he asked her. "I didn't have time to imagine it," she said. "I just ran toward it." She looked at the water. "It is bigger than I expected. The sky mostly. The sky is much bigger." "It takes some getting used to," he said. "I grew up in Texas." "The sky is big in Texas too, but the Nevada sky is different. It's more serious." She laughed. "A serious sky. A sky that knows what it's doing," he said, and she laughed again. And this time he smiled too, a real one, the kind that changed his whole face from simply composed to genuinely warm. And Adelaide thought that if she was not careful, she was going to be in serious trouble long before Friday's court session. She looked back at the water. That evening they sat on Caleb's porch after dinner, just the two of them. Pearl had gone home and Caleb had retired early. The Nevada night was coming on cool and clear, the stars appearing one by one like they were being placed with deliberate care. "You don't have to stay for the full week," Adelaide said, because she had been thinking about it. "Once the court rules on Friday, you have done what you agreed to do. You don't owe me the remaining days." He looked at her sideways. "I know I don't owe you anything. I just wanted you to know you are free to go whenever, Adelaide." He said her name in a particular way, not sharp, just direct, the way he said most things. "I am not going anywhere." She looked at him. He was looking at the street, the lantern light from inside the house touching his face, and she could see the line of his jaw and the quiet certainty in his expression. "Why not?" she asked. He turned to look at her then. "Because I would like to stay," he said, and left it at that. She did not push it further. She sat with it instead, the way you sit with something warm, carefully, so as not to spill it. Friday morning arrived with a cold blue sky and the nervous tension of something that had been building all week. Adelaide dressed in her best remaining dress, a dark blue wool that Pearl had helped her press the night before, and Emmett wore a clean white shirt and his better jacket and looked, Adelaide thought privately, like a man who could walk into any court in the country and hold his own. They arrived at the county courthouse before Holt did, which was the plan. Samuel Briggs was already there with Adelaide's papers filed and organized, and he greeted them with the quiet satisfaction of a lawyer who believed he had the stronger case. The courthouse was a single large room with a judge's bench, 2 tables for opposing parties, and a row of chairs along the wall for observers. Judge Harold Fenwick presided, a tall, thin man of about 60 who had been a judge in Nevada since before it was a state, and who had the weary authority of someone who had seen every variety of human foolishness and still believed, against the evidence, in the possibility of justice. Holt arrived with his 2 hired men and a lawyer Adelaide had not seen before, a city type in a good suit who radiated the particular confidence of someone who charged a great deal of money for his services. The proceedings were not long, but they were tense. Holt's lawyer presented the debt papers with smooth authority. He spoke about the original agreement, the outstanding amount, the transfer of the land deed as proper settlement of the debt. He was very good, Adelaide had to admit. He made it sound perfectly reasonable. Then Briggs stood up, and he presented Adelaide's papers, the original correspondence, the original terms, Thomas's own letters laying out clearly what he had borrowed and what the agreed repayment was. He noted the discrepancy between the original figure and the amount Holt was claiming. He noted the irregular dating on Holt's documents. He spoke plainly and without theatrics, and the plain truth was a better argument than the polished one. Then Emmett was called to speak. He stood before Judge Fenwick and spoke with the steady, unhurried clarity of a man who was telling the truth, which he mostly was. He spoke about Adelaide's situation, about Thomas's original debt and its agreed terms, about the difference between what was owed and what was being claimed. He was not dramatic. He was simply factual and credible, and there was something about a man who spoke with that kind of measured certainty that a room tended to believe. Holt's lawyer pressed him on the marriage. When had they married? How long had he known Adelaide? Why had no one in Kansas been informed? "A man's private life is his private life," Emmett said. "We married last October. Adelaide was still in grief and we kept it quiet. That's between her and me and God, and I don't see that it has any bearing on whether Gerald Holt can add $150 to a debt that was already paid down." Judge Fenwick asked a few clarifying questions and then called for a short recess. Adelaide and Emmett sat at the table and waited. Holt stared at them from across the room with an expression that had moved from calculation to something closer to anger, which Adelaide thought was a good sign. Angry men had usually realized they were losing. Briggs leaned over and said quietly, "He knows it isn't going well. His lawyer is very good, but our documentation is better." The recess lasted 20 minutes. When Judge Fenwick returned, he was carrying a piece of paper and a pen, and an expression of complete judicial serenity. He ruled in Adelaide's favor. The original debt, he stated, was the one documented in Thomas Bailey's correspondence, and the documented payments Adelaide had made brought the remaining balance to $62, which could be settled at the standard rate over 12 months. Holt's claim to the deed was dismissed. Any further harassment of Mrs. Quinn, the judge added, looking over his spectacles at Holt with the specific kind of firmness that very old authority could generate, would be treated as a legal matter in its own right. Holt left the courthouse with his expensive lawyer and his 2 hired men and a very stiff back, and Adelaide sat at the table for a moment after he was gone and simply breathed. Briggs shook Emmett's hand. Emmett accepted it and then looked at Adelaide, who was still breathing. "You all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "I just need a moment." He sat down beside her and waited while she had her moment, and she thought that this was an undervalued quality in a person, the ability to simply sit beside someone while they collected themselves. "Thank you," she said when she was ready. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Holt isn't the kind of man who accepts a ruling gracefully. He'll go back to Kansas and he might try something else." "I know," she said, "but not today. Today it's done." "Today it's done," he agreed. Pearl had been sitting in the observers' chairs, and she appeared now with her arms out, and Adelaide stood and let herself be hugged fiercely by her cousin, which was exactly the kind of physical reassurance she had not realized she needed until she was in the middle of it. "Well done," Pearl said, pulling back to look at her. "Well done, Adelaide." They went to the saloon, which was not the kind of thing Adelaide had done very often in her life, but which seemed like exactly the right response to the morning. Caleb Marsh joined them, and they had whiskey, all 4 of them, and Adelaide drank hers in 2 swallows and set the glass down, and felt the warmth of it spread through her chest and mix with the relief that was still moving through her in slow waves. Emmett had nursed his own glass and watched the room with that steady attention of his, and when she looked at him, he looked back and raised his glass slightly in a toast, just the 2 of them, and she felt it like a hand pressed briefly over her heart. That night, the pretense became complicated in a new way. They were walking back from Pearl's house, where they had eaten a celebratory dinner, and the evening was dark and cool and full of stars. They were not walking close together, the way they had been in public when the performance required it. There was several inches of proper distance between them, and Adelaide found she was acutely aware of that distance in a way she had not been before Friday, as if the court ruling had removed one kind of tension and left room for a different kind. "The week technically ends in 3 days, she said. "Does it?" he said. "That was the arrangement." "It was." She stopped walking. He stopped walking beside her. The saloon was a block away, and its light fell across the street in a warm yellow rectangle, and somewhere a fiddle was playing something slow and sweet. "Emmett," she said, "I want to be honest with you." "I'd expect nothing less," he said. She looked at him. In the dark, with only the distant lantern light and the enormous Nevada stars, he looked exactly like himself, which was becoming a face she knew quite well. "I don't know what to do with you," she said. "I came here with a problem that needed solving, and you solved it. And now I am standing on this street trying to understand what the rest of this week is, and what I am feeling doesn't feel like pretending anymore, and I am not sure it has for a while." He was very still. "I know that is not what we agreed," she said. "And I know it may not be what you want. And if it isn't, tell me plainly, and I will respect it, and we will finish the week and go our separate ways. But I would rather say it than spend 3 more days pretending I don't feel it." The fiddle continued from the direction of the saloon, unhurried. Emmett turned his hat in his hands, the slow rotation she had learned to recognize as his way of finding words. Then he put it back on and looked at her. "I haven't felt like I was pretending since the first morning in the general store," he said. She let that settle over her like light. "That's a significant thing to say," she told him. "I'm aware. What do we do with it?" He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair back behind her ear, the most gentle, precise thing, and left his hand against her cheek for just a moment. "We don't throw away the rest of the week," he said. She put her hand over his, where it rested against her face. "No," she agreed. "We don't." They stood there on the dark street with the fiddle playing and the stars overhead and the complicated, beautiful truth of it settling around them both, and then they walked back to Caleb's house side by side, closer than they had been before. Saturday was different from all the days that had come before it because nothing was required and nothing was performed. The court session was done. The formal necessity of the pretense had served its purpose. What remained was the week itself. 3 more days in which they were, by the terms of the arrangement, still playing husband and wife, except that neither of them was playing. Adelaide helped him with the cattle in the morning. He taught her how to identify which of his cows were close to calving, showing her what to look for with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed passing knowledge on. She asked questions, and he answered them, and they worked through the morning in the warm, easy rhythm that had developed between them over the past several days, which was beginning to feel like the most natural thing in the world. At midday they sat in the shade of the porch and ate the lunch Adelaide had packed: cold cornbread and dried beef, and a jar of pickled vegetables from Pearl's pantry. And Emmett told her about his time in Texas before he came to Nevada, the cattle drives he had worked on as a young man, the years of sleeping under open sky and eating bad food and working from before sunrise to past sunset. He spoke about it without nostalgia and without complaint, just as a fact of what his early life had been. "Were you ever married?" she asked. She had been curious about this since the beginning but had not found the right moment to ask. "No," he said. "Close," he considered. "There was a woman in Austin. About 4 years ago. She was a school teacher. We kept company for about a year. What happened? She wanted to go east. Her family was in Virginia and she missed them. She wanted a life I wasn't interested in building, and I had a life she wasn't interested in living. It ended honestly. We parted on good terms. No hard feelings. None worth keeping," he said, which she thought was one of the wiser things she had heard anyone say. She looked out at his land. "Could you see spending your whole life out here?" she asked. "In Nevada?" "I could," he said without hesitation. "Though lately I have been thinking about things I might want to change." She looked at him. He looked back at her with that direct, quiet gaze that she was beginning to understand as simply the way he was when he was telling you something he meant. "Nothing needs to be decided this week," she said. "No," he agreed. "But some things are already being decided whether you make a formal decision or not." She thought about that for a long time after he said it. Sunday brought Pearl and Caleb for a proper dinner at the ranch, which Emmett cooked himself. A beef stew that was significantly better than anything Adelaide might have predicted from a man who lived alone. Pearl helped herself to 2 portions and praised him lavishly, and then spent the rest of the meal watching Emmett and Adelaide with the alert eyes of someone enjoying a story she had helped set in motion. After dinner, Caleb and Emmett smoked on the porch and talked about cattle prices, and Pearl and Adelaide washed the dishes inside. "You are not leaving at the end of the week, are you?" Pearl said. It was not quite a question. Adelaide dried a plate. "I have not decided anything formally." "Is that so?" "Don't look at me like that. I am looking at you like a woman who can see what is in front of her face," Pearl said, "which is more than can be said for some women in certain situations." Adelaide set the plate down. "Pearl, I came here to solve a legal problem. The week was the arrangement." "The arrangement was a starting point," Pearl said. "Most things are." She handed Adelaide another dish. "He is a good man, Adelaide. You know that. I wouldn't have asked him if he wasn't. I know he is. And you are not the kind of woman who needs rescuing. You had the papers. You had the brains. All you needed was someone to stand beside you. He stood beside you." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Emmett's low voice saying something and Caleb's laugh in response, and the sound of it was so comfortable, so ordinary and warm that it ached. "I'm scared," she said. "Not of him, of wanting something again." Pearl dried her hands on her apron. "That is the most understandable thing you have said all week," she said, "and it is not a good enough reason to go." That night, after Pearl and Caleb had gone, Emmett and Adelaide sat by the fireplace in the ranch house because the night had gone cold and the fire made the small room warm and close. Adelaide had her knees drawn up to her chest and was reading a newspaper Caleb had brought from town, and Emmett was doing something with a length of leather, tooling a pattern into a piece of tack with a small knife, working with the focused ease of long practice. She watched him work for a while without saying anything. "I had a letter from my mother before I left Kansas," she said eventually. "She died 2 years ago, but I found a letter she had written to me that she never sent. I don't know why she never sent it." He set the leather down. "What did it say?" "She told me that the hardest thing she had ever learned was that life was not a single straight road. She said she had always believed that if you made good choices and worked hard, the road would stay straight. And when my father lost the farm, she realized the road never was straight and never would be, and that was not a tragedy, but simply what roads were." She paused. "She said the important thing was not the straightness but who you walked with." The fire crackled. "She sounds like she was very wise," Emmett said. "She was," Adelaide said. "I think I am only understanding her letter now." He looked at her, and the firelight was golden and warm between them, and she felt the moment the way you sometimes feel a very significant moment, fully and completely, while you are still in it. "Adelaide," he said. "I know," she said. He reached across and took her hand, very gently, the way you take something you want to be careful with. He held it without saying anything else, and she let him, and the fire burned down slowly, and the Nevada night went deep and cold outside the walls of the house that he had built, mostly by himself, over 2 long, careful years. Monday was the last full day of the week they had agreed upon, and neither of them mentioned it. Emmett had cattle to move to the northern pasture, which required most of the morning. Adelaide rode with him, handling the borrowed horse with a competence that pleased both of them, working the outer edge of the herd while he worked the center. It was good, honest work, and it made her feel capable and present in the way that only physical labor in open space can. In the afternoon, they went back to town together because Adelaide needed to post a letter to Abner Cross in Kansas informing him of the court outcome. And while she was at the post office, Emmett went to speak with the sheriff about Holt, who was, according to word around town, still in Dusty Creek and had not yet purchased a stage ticket. Adelaide posted her letter and came out of the post office to find Emmett waiting for her at the edge of the walk with an expression that was controlled but slightly more alert than usual. "Holt is still here," she said. "He's been asking questions at the land office," Emmett said. "Nothing he can legally do, but he's looking for angles." Adelaide felt a cold movement in her chest. "He will not accept the ruling." "He accepts it," Emmett said. "He just doesn't like it, and men like him don't stop just because a judge tells them to. He'll leave eventually. The law is clear and he knows it, but he might try to make things uncomfortable before he goes." "What kind of uncomfortable?" Emmett's jaw set slightly. "The kind he thinks a woman alone can't handle." "I am not alone," Adelaide said. He looked at her, and the thing in his expression was not just the performance of a husband but something much more personal than that. "No," he said, "you are not." She reached out and took his arm, not because they were in a public place where the pretense needed maintaining, but because she wanted to, and they walked back through the main street of Dusty Creek together with the afternoon light long and warm on the dusty road. Holt found them at the end of Main Street, which Adelaide was beginning to think was his habitual spot for confrontations. He was alone this time, without his hired men, which was different and somehow more unsettling. He stopped in front of them and he looked at Adelaide, and his small eyes were cold with the particular kind of anger that a man gets when he has decided that a woman's refusal is a personal insult rather than a legal right. "The ruling won't hold," he said. "I have lawyers in Reno who will look at it." "Then take it to Reno," Emmett said. "The documentation will hold anywhere." "You think you've won something," Holt said to Adelaide. "You haven't. You think this man can protect you forever." He made a gesture toward Emmett that was dismissive in a way that was clearly intended to provoke. Emmett did not take the provocation. He stood very still and he said, quietly and clearly, "You are going to finish your business in this town, and then you are going to leave. And if you come anywhere near my wife again while you are here, you and I are going to have a conversation that you will not enjoy." It was not a threat in the dramatic sense. It was simply a statement of what would happen, delivered with the total conviction of a man who always followed through on what he said. And something about that total conviction was more effective than any amount of raised voices could have been. Holt looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at Adelaide and then looked back at the street, and he walked away. Adelaide exhaled. "Are you all right?" Emmett asked. "Fine," she said. "I am fine." She paused. "That was very effective." "He's not brave," Emmett said. "He picks people he thinks are weaker than him. That is the whole of his strategy." "He will go to Reno, maybe," Emmett said, "but the documentation will hold. Briggs knows what he's doing." He looked at her. "And I will testify in Reno too if it comes to that." She stopped walking. "Emmett, you do not have to." "Adelaide." He turned to look at her fully. "Stop telling me what I don't have to do." She looked at him. The street was around them, the ordinary life of Dusty Creek moving in its daily currents, and in the middle of it this man stood with his hat shading his eyes and his voice completely certain. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. They walked back to the ranch. Monday evening they made supper together. It was a small domestic thing, not the grand romantic gesture of novels, but just the two of them in the kitchen, Adelaide cutting vegetables and Emmett managing the stove, and both of them talking about small things. What the North pasture needed, whether the pickled vegetables Pearl had sent were better than last year's, what the winter usually looked like in this part of Nevada. It was the most ordinary conversation, and it was the most contented Adelaide had felt since before Thomas got sick. And when she recognized that fact, standing at the kitchen table with a knife in her hand, she had to set the knife down for a moment and simply stand with it. Emmett noticed. He always noticed. "What is it?" he asked. She turned around. "Nothing bad," she said. "Something good. I'm just not used to it yet." He looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and put his hands on her shoulders, gently, the way he seemed to do all things that involved her, as if she was something worth being careful with. "You should get used to it," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think I should." He kissed her then, soft and unhurried, the way a man kisses a woman when he is not trying to prove anything but simply wants her to know what is true. Adelaide stood very still for a moment, and then her hands came up to his chest, and she kissed him back, and it was the most honest thing either of them had done all week. When they separated, he was still holding her shoulders and she had her hands flat on his chest, and they were both looking at each other with the slightly wondering expression of people who have just confirmed something they already suspected. "That was not part of the arrangement," Adelaide said. "No," he agreed. "It was not." "Are we amending the arrangement?" "I think we left the arrangement behind some time ago," he said. She smiled, and she had not smiled like that in a very long time, the kind that came from somewhere deep and sure. "I think you might be right." They ate dinner and talked until late, the fire burning low and the Nevada stars doing their enormous patient work outside the windows. He told her about the time he had driven cattle from Amarillo to Dodge City, in a spring that seemed to produce a new disaster every other day. She told him about the summer she was 15 when she and her father had brought in the harvest alone because her mother was ill, and it had taken them 6 weeks and they had done it. They traded stories back and forth like good currency, and with each one Adelaide felt more known and more knowing. She stayed at the ranch that night in the second bedroom, which was small and clean and smelled faintly of cedar, and she lay awake for a long time not because she was anxious, but because she was thinking about the future, which was something she had not let herself think about properly since Thomas died. The future was a strange and tender thing to consider. It did not look like what she had imagined when she was 19 and newly married, full of prairie dreams. It looked like something different, something she had not known she wanted because she had not known it existed. It looked like this ranch, these hills, this particular serious sky. It looked like a man who listened before he spoke and meant what he said and made stew better than expected. She fell asleep thinking about it and slept better than she had in months. Tuesday, technically, was the last day of the 1 week they had agreed upon. Neither of them acknowledged this. Adelaide came out of the bedroom to find Emmett making coffee, and he poured her a cup and handed it to her, and they stood in the kitchen in the early light, and she thought, very clearly, I do not want to leave. She had her land in Kansas. The court ruling protected it. She could go back to Caldwell and pay down the remaining $62 and live on her farm and plant her garden and be a woman who had done everything right and ended up alone on a piece of land that held more ghosts than people. Or she could say what she was thinking. She had established by now that she was the kind of woman who said what she was thinking. Emmett, she said. Yes, he said. I don't want to go back to Kansas. He set his coffee cup down. He turned to look at her fully, giving her his complete attention the way he did when something important was being said. All right, he said. I have land there. I can sell it or rent it out. It's not worth much, but it's worth something. I know you have land there, he said. I'm telling you that because I want you to know that I'm not coming to you without anything. I have something. I'm not desperate and I'm not without options and I am not choosing this because I'm afraid. I know that too, he said. She looked at him. I'm choosing this because I want to. He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with the most open expression she had seen on him in a week of learning his face. Adelaide Bailey, he said. I have been hoping you'd say something like that since approximately Wednesday, she laughed. Wednesday, you decided on Wednesday. I thought about it seriously on Wednesday, he said. I had already considered it on Tuesday. That was very fast, she said. When you know, he said, which was the least complicated thing a man could say and also, she thought, the most true. He kissed her again, and this time she kissed him back without wondering what it meant, because she knew what it meant. They spent the day on the ranch and they were easy together, easy in the way of people who have made a decision and feel the rightness of it. And Adelaide learned where he kept the tools and asked about the winter grazing and made plans in her head about what a kitchen garden would look like on the south side of the house where the sun hit longest. In the afternoon, they rode into town to see Pearl, because Adelaide wanted to tell her herself, and because Pearl had been instrumental in all of this and deserved to hear it directly. Pearl opened the door and looked at them standing on her porch together and said, Well, it is about time, in the tone of someone who had been waiting for news they had already predicted. We haven't formally decided everything, Adelaide said. You are standing on my porch in the same way and looking at each other in the same way, and what exactly remains undecided, Pearl said, stepping back to let them in. The proposal, Emmett said. Adelaide turned to look at him. I have not formally asked, he said with complete equanimity. I was planning to wait until I had a ring to offer. Where are you going to get a ring in Dusty Creek? Pearl said. The jeweler over on Cedar Street has a few things, Emmett said. I looked last week. Adelaide stared at him. Last week. Thursday, he said. I was optimistic. Pearl made a sound that was either laughter or something overwhelmed and went to put the kettle on because she needed something to do with herself. Adelaide looked at Emmett with the full measure of everything she felt, which was considerable and warm and slightly overwhelming and entirely wonderful. You looked at rings on Thursday, she said. I'm a man who believes in being prepared, he said. She took his hand. Go get the ring, Emmett. He went and got the ring. It was a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, modest and beautiful. And he went down on one knee in Pearl's kitchen with Pearl standing by the stove trying to look casual and failing entirely. And he asked Adelaide Bailey if she would marry him, properly, as herself, not as a pretense or an arrangement, but as a woman he intended to spend his life with, and hoped she intended to spend hers with him. She said yes with a certainty that surprised even her with its completeness. Pearl cried, which she immediately denied. They told Caleb Marsh that evening over supper, and he shook Emmett's hand at length and then hugged Adelaide, which seemed to surprise him slightly and please him considerably. Holt left Dusty Creek on Wednesday morning stage. Adelaide saw him go from the window of the hotel where she and Pearl had gone for coffee, and she watched the stage pull away with his stiff-suited figure visible through the window, and she felt something unclench in her that had been tight since the day he had first shown up at her door in Kansas. "Gone," Pearl said. "Gone," Adelaide agreed. "Will he go to Reno?" "Maybe," Adelaide said. "But Briggs says the documentation is solid, and Emmett says he'll testify anywhere it's needed, and I think Holt is going to calculate the cost of further pursuit against the likelihood of success and decide it isn't worth it. And if he decides it is worth it," Adelaide looked at Pearl, "then we deal with it, together." Pearl nodded with satisfaction. "Look at you," she said. "You came here running from something. Now you're deciding what to do about what comes next." "I had help," Adelaide said. "The best kind of help," Pearl said. "The kind that makes you feel like yourself rather than less." Adelaide thought about that for the rest of the day. They were married on a Saturday in October of 1882, 8 weeks after Adelaide had stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, with Thomas's wedding ring on the wrong hand and nothing but courage and a few old letters to protect her interests. The ceremony was held in the small Methodist church at the end of Cedar Street, performed by a reverend named Foster, who had a magnificent set of mutton-chop whiskers and an earnest delivery that made everything he said sound deeply considered. Pearl stood up with Adelaide, wearing her best dress, a deep green wool that she had made herself. Caleb Marsh stood up with Emmett, looking uncomfortable in a formal collar, but pleased in a way that his general stoicism couldn't quite conceal. There were perhaps 30 people in the church, which was most of the people in Dusty Creek who had taken any notice of the two of them over the preceding weeks, along with several of Emmett's ranching neighbors who had come in from the surrounding land, and who were clearly pleased that their quiet bachelor neighbor had settled his personal situation in such a sensible direction. Adelaide wore her mother's blue dress, altered and pressed, with her mother's pearl brooch at the collar, and she carried a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers that Emmett had gathered from the eastern meadow that morning before she was awake. When she came down the aisle of the church on Caleb's arm, she saw Emmett standing at the front with the same composed certainty with which he did everything, and then she saw his expression change when he saw her, going from composed to something unguarded and warm and altogether herself, and she felt it like a hand pressed over her heart. They made their vows in front of Reverend Foster and the 30 people of Dusty Creek and the large, serious Nevada sky outside the church windows. And when Adelaide said, "I do," she meant all of it. The promises and the future and the man standing in front of her who had agreed to help a stranger in a difficult situation and had ended up being the best thing that ever came of her worst year. Emmett kissed her when the Reverend said he could, and someone in the back of the church whistled, and Pearl cried again, which she again immediately denied. The reception was at Pearl's house, which was the largest private space available, and everyone brought food and someone brought a fiddle, and the evening went long and warm and full. Adelaide danced with Emmett, who was a better dancer than she had expected and said so, and he said that he had grown up in Texas where dancing was a survival skill, and she laughed and they danced another one. Later, when most of the guests had gone and Pearl was washing dishes with Caleb's help, Adelaide and Emmett stood on Pearl's porch in the October night, which was cold and clear and crowded with stars. "How does it feel?" he asked her, "being officially you instead of officially pretending?" She thought about it. "Like being able to put something down you've been carrying," she said, "except it's a good putting down, not because the weight was bad but because your hands are free now." He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, and they stood there for a while with the night around them. "I wrote to my mother," he said, "to tell her." "What did you write?" That I had met someone worth changing my plans for, he said. She looked up at him. What plans did you change? I was going to spend the rest of my life on my ranch being a very competent and completely solitary man, he said, and the corner of his mouth was doing the thing it did when he was amused. I had it all worked out. That sounds lonely, Adelaide said. I was used to it, he said. That is not the same as it being good. She put her hand against his chest, over his heart, the way she had in Pearl's kitchen on the night he had kissed her the first time. She could feel it beating, steady and sure. I'm glad the stage was late, she said. He looked at her. The Dusty Creek stage was late getting in, she said. Did you know that? It was supposed to arrive at noon and it arrived at 3. If it had been on time, Gerald Holt would have been waiting at the station, and I would have seen him immediately, and I don't know what would have happened. You would have managed, he said. I would have tried, she said, but the stage was late and I got 3 hours in town before he found me, and that 3 hours is why I found Pearl, and Pearl is why I found you. He was quiet for a moment. I think you would have found a way regardless, he said. You're not the kind of woman who runs out of ideas. I had run pretty low by then, she admitted. He tightened his arm around her. Well, he said, you don't have to run low again. She settled against him and looked at the stars and thought about her mother's letter, about the road that never had been straight, about the woman who had written that the important thing was not the straightness, but who you walked with. She had found who she walked with. She was quite certain of it. The winter that followed was hard in the way Nevada winters were hard, dry and cold and long, but the ranch house kept warm with the iron stove they had brought out from town, and Adelaide's kitchen garden had been put to bed under a layer of straw that would see the root vegetables through until spring. She had written to Caldwell and arranged for her Kansas land to be rented to a family named Hatch who had 3 children and needed the space, at a rate that would pay off the remaining $62 within 2 years and leave a little besides. Holt did not go to Reno. Abner Cross wrote to Adelaide in November to say that Holt had accepted the ruling and that the papers were fully settled, and Adelaide had read the letter twice and then put it in the cedar box where she kept important things and felt the last of it release from her shoulders. She and Emmett worked the ranch through the winter together, because Adelaide was not content to simply keep the house while he kept the cattle, and because Emmett, to his credit, never suggested she should be. She learned the land the way you learn something you intend to keep, carefully and thoroughly, and Emmett learned that Adelaide had opinions about where the fencing should be extended and which of the cattle seemed smarter than the others, and he found that he liked this about her in the same way he liked everything about her, thoroughly and without reservation. Pearl came to dinner twice a week. Caleb came on Saturdays. The community around Dusty Creek, the ranching families and the town people, accepted Adelaide with the practical openness of frontier people who judged a person more on what they did than on where they came from. She was Quinn's wife. She worked hard. She was fair in her dealings, that was enough. In the spring of 1883, Adelaide told Emmett she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, early on a March morning with the stove warm and the coffee made and the first light coming through the window over the sink. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and watched his face. He sat down. This was unusual. Emmett Quinn was not a man who sat down unexpectedly. He sat down in the kitchen chair and looked at the table for a moment, and then looked at her, and she could see every feeling on his face because he had stopped managing them, and what she saw there was joy of the uncomplicated and total kind. He stood back up and crossed to her and held her carefully, the way you hold something suddenly precious. She put her arms around him and laughed a little because the relief of it, the relief of his reaction, was something she had not realized she had been waiting for. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "It's very early, but yes." He pulled back to look at her face. "A baby," he said, as if confirming the word. "A baby," she agreed. He kissed her forehead. "Lord," he said softly. She laughed again. "That is a restrained response." "I am trying to maintain some dignity," he said, and then he smiled so broadly that all the dignity went immediately, and she thought it was the best she had ever seen him look. Pearl received the news with tears she did not bother to deny this time, and Caleb received it with a handshake for Emmett and a gentle hug for Adelaide and the expression of a man who found the world occasionally and beautifully logical. The baby came in November of 1883, the way babies do, with a great deal of urgency and noise that the November wind outside seemed to match. Pearl was there, and the town midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Cates, and Emmett was downstairs in the kitchen doing things that required no attention because he could not sit still. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas James Quinn, Thomas for Adelaide's late husband, who had been a good man whose memory deserved honoring, and James for Emmett's father, who had died young and whose son had built something in his name. When Emmett held his son for the first time, standing beside Adelaide's bed with the lamp low and the November wind outside, and the baby making the small conclusive sounds of new life, he was very quiet for a long time. Adelaide watched him and felt the fullness of the room, all the love that was present in it, all the roads that had bent and turned and eventually led here. "Hello," Emmett said to his son, very softly. "I am very glad you're here." Adelaide reached out and put her hand on his arm, and he looked at her over the baby's head, and what passed between them in that look was everything that the past year and a half had been. The desperation and the pretense and the risk and the honesty and the choosing, all of it resolving in this warm lamplit room with a boy named Thomas James who had his father's dark hair and his mother's creekwater eyes. "Are you glad?" Adelaide asked him. "Beyond what I can sensibly express," he said. She settled back against the pillow. "Then express it anyway." He sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb her, holding his son. "When you stepped off that stage," he said, "I had no idea what was coming. Pearl just said there was a woman who needed help, and I thought, well, I can help. I've helped before. And then I walked into Pearl's kitchen and you stood up to face me before you said a word, and I thought, this is not an ordinary woman. I was trying to seem capable," she said. "I was terrified." "You were both," he said. "That's not a contradiction," she smiled. "And then we stood in the general store with Holt looking at us and you didn't flinch, and I thought, I don't want this week to end." He looked at her steadily. "I never wanted it to end." She reached up and touched his face. "It didn't end," she said. "It just became something else." "Something better," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Something very much better." Outside, the November wind moved through the Nevada high desert, and the stars were doing their large and patient work above the land that he had built and she had chosen, and they were building together. The baby slept in his father's arms with the profound confidence of someone who had arrived somewhere safe. The fire in the kitchen stove below sent warmth through the whole small house, and Adelaide Bailey Quinn, who had once stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but courage and a few old letters and the desperate hope that there was still something worth fighting for, lay in her warm bed in her solid house and felt, with the full and quiet certainty of someone who has traveled a long road and knows when they are home, that there was nothing left in the world she needed to run from. She had come west to save something. She had ended up finding something she had not known was lost. The week had been the beginning. The life was everything after. 3 years later, in the fall of 1886, Adelaide stood on the porch of the ranch house watching Thomas, now almost 3, chase a chicken across the yard with the focused determination that characterized everything he did, which was entirely his father's expression on a considerably smaller face. She was pregnant again, farther along this time, and the October light was warm on her shoulders, and the hills to the west were going amber and copper with the season. Emmett came up behind her and put his arms around her carefully, his chin resting on the top of her head. "He's going to catch that chicken," Emmett said. "He has caught chickens before," Adelaide said. "He knows what to do." Sure enough, Thomas made one final precise lunge and came up with the chicken, who accepted its fate with the dignity of a bird who had been caught before. "Put it down gently," Emmett called. Thomas put it down gently. The chicken walked away with great self-possession. "Good boy," Emmett said. Thomas looked up at them with Emmett's composed expression and Adelaide's golden brown eyes and the particular pride of a small person who has successfully completed a task, and Adelaide felt her heart do the thing it did regularly in these years, the thing that was simply love, uncomplicated and enormous. "Pearl is coming to dinner," she said. "I know." "She's bringing someone," Adelaide said. "A man named Donovan who runs the new telegraph office." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "She told you that?" "She mentioned it in a way that was meant to seem casual," Adelaide said. "Ah," said Emmett. "Good. She deserves it," Adelaide said. "She does," he agreed. He tightened his arms around her gently. "She also deserves credit for the whole thing." "She will take it," Adelaide said. "She always does." He laughed, which was something he did more freely now than he had in that first week, and she loved the sound of it, low and warm and real. She leaned back against him and looked at the hills and the sky and the yard, where Thomas was now engaged in conversation with the chicken he had just released, apparently explaining something of importance. The second child, a daughter, came in January of 1887, arriving in the middle of a snowstorm that was unusual for the Nevada high desert but not unheard of. They named her Clara Ruth Quinn, Clara for the sound of it and Ruth for Emmett's mother in Ohio, who had written a letter so warm upon learning of the pregnancy that Adelaide had read it 3 times and kept it in the cedar box beside her most important things. Thomas took to his sister with the protective gravity of a big brother who understood the assignment. He was 3½ and very serious about it. Pearl came to see Clara on the second day and held her for a long time by the window, and the man named Donovan stood in the kitchen talking cattle prices with Emmett, and Adelaide watched them from across the room and thought that Pearl's face had changed in the past few months, had opened a little in the way faces do when someone is being properly loved. She said nothing about this because she did not need to. She simply noted it and was glad. Holt's name had not crossed her mind in the better part of 2 years. He was back in Kansas, presumably pursuing other opportunities with the same combination of persistence and moral flexibility. The land in Kansas continued to be rented by the Hatch family, who grew good wheat and sent payments reliably. Adelaide had thought once or twice about selling it outright, but she had not decided, and Emmett said there was no hurry on a decision that did not need to be hurried. She loved that about him too. The patience with things that could wait, and the directness about things that could not. In the spring of 1887, Samuel Briggs invited them to a dinner at his house along with several of the county's other ranching families. An annual thing that was part social and part practical, the kind of gathering where people discussed water rights and cattle prices and the state of the roads in a convivial atmosphere. Adelaide went in her good dress and sat at a long table and talked about irrigation with a woman named Mrs. Hartwell from the neighboring property, and across the table she could see Emmett talking with the judge about something political and making his point with the quiet precision that always worked, and she thought, "This is my life. This real, ordinary, vivid, specific life is mine." She had not expected this exactly. She had not expected Nevada or this ranch or this man or these children or this feeling of being entirely located in her own existence. She had expected to get through. She had expected to survive. She had not expected to arrive. But here she was. That evening, riding home in the wagon with Thomas asleep against her shoulder and baby Clara in the basket at her feet, and Emmett beside her on the bench handling the horses with his usual easy competence, Adelaide looked up at the Nevada stars, which were doing their enormous patient work as always, and felt the completeness of everything. "You're quiet," Emmett said. "I'm thinking," she said. "What about," she considered how to say it, "about the stagecoach," she said finally, "about the day I arrived." He looked at her sideways in the dark. "I was so frightened," she said, "and so determined not to show it, and I had this one plan that depended entirely on a stranger agreeing to help me, which was a plan that should not have worked." "But it did," he said. "It did," she said, Because you said yes." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily through the night, and Thomas shifted in his sleep and made a small sound and settled again. "I've thought about that too," Emmett said. "About what would have happened if I'd said no. If Pearl's note had caught me on a different day when I was out on the range or moving cattle or just not in the right frame of mind. Would you have said no?" "No," he said simply. "I don't think I would have, not once Pearl explained the situation." "But you didn't know it would turn into this," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I'm glad it did." She leaned against his shoulder carefully with Thomas between them. He shifted slightly to accommodate her, and they rode on through the Nevada night, which was cold and clear and full of the sound of the desert, the coyotes and the wind, and the small movements of creatures going about their patient lives in the dark. "I'm glad too," she said. "I'm glad it did." He pressed a brief kiss to the top of her head, a familiar thing by now, one of the small daily expressions of a love that had settled into the deep and lasting kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it is simply present in everything, in the morning coffee and the evening fire and the children's voices, and the long, quiet work of building something together on ground that is yours. They came to the ranch, and Emmett lifted Thomas down without waking him and carried him inside, and Adelaide brought Clara and settled her in the crib, and the house was warm and full and entirely itself, exactly what it was and nothing it was not. Later, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, they sat together by the fire the way they often did, Adelaide with her book and Emmett with whatever piece of tack or equipment needed his attention, and the fire burned and the night was around the house, and inside there was only warmth. Adelaide looked up from her book and looked at him, at his bent head and steady hands, at the face she had been learning for 5 years and still found new things in, and she felt the fullness of it, the good, honest fullness of a life that had been saved and rebuilt and turned into something better than the original plan. "Emmett," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "For that first yes." He looked at her for a moment with his honest, direct gaze, and then the corner of his mouth turned in the way it did. "Thank you," he said, "for asking." The fire crackled. Outside, the Nevada stars continued their ancient patient work. The children slept. And Adelaide Quinn, who had once been Adelaide Bailey running toward a desperate plan in a strange town, sat in the home she had helped build with the man she had come to love through the most improbable of doors. And she was, quietly and completely and without reservation, at peace.